So welcome everyone to our seminar today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jill Baumgartner. Jill is an assistant professor at McGill University. Actually, when the first time I met Jill, we found out that we were from the same hometown, and anybody can guess where that is. That's true. That's true. And since then, so Jill completed her PhD at the University of Wisconsin, also worked with Majid Azadi at Harvard at the time, did a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, actually working on a joint UBC University of Minnesota project in India, and a year ago moved to McGill. Jill does some really fascinating work on the sort of intersection between development, urban and rural development, environmental quality, public health, global health, with a specific focus on China, where she actually served for several years as a Peace Corps volunteer. So her work is, I think, really fascinating, really pertinent, very dynamic, and I'm very pleased to hear what you have to tell us today. And I will let you take over from there.
Oh wow, I'm a loudspeaker, so I'm gonna move this away a little bit so I don't blow everyone out. So hi, thank you, Mike. It's my pleasure to be here today. I need to sort of say I'm glad that I'm presenting to a public health group today. Because yesterday I gave a talk and it was sort of more focused on the problems, and today I'm going to be talking about the solutions, or what I think are some of the potential solutions for these problems around household energy use. So for those of you who probably have seen some version of this before, these are the leading contributors to the global burden of disease. So in low-income countries, there's been a recent transition to older age mortality. Perfect, it's better. So there's a transition that's happened to older age mortality, and that's led to these disease transitions where people in both developed and developing countries, a shift to cardiovascular and chronic diseases. And environmental pollution is a big part of that picture. So these are the leading risk factors for the global burden of disease from the comparative risk assessment. And it also shows the disease etiology. So this is their contribution to the disease burden and what specifically people are, diseases people are affected by. And this measure being disability adjusted life years, this is a measure that combines premature mortality, or years of life lost due to premature mortality, and as well as years lived in less than full health. So I'm talking mostly today about household air pollution from solid fuels. So this is the fourth leading contributor to the global burden of disease. And a big portion of that, so you can kind of see this, oops, I'm not supposed to point, I'm supposed to use this. So a large portion of that disease burden is blue, which is cardiovascular diseases. And I'm talking today a lot about China. So China is a place where I've done a lot of my work. And it also reflects this transition. So these are the leading causes of death in China in 1990 and 2010. We see cardiovascular diseases are the largest contributor to mortality, with other chronic diseases being part of that. And similarly to this global trend, environmental pollutants are large contributors to that disease burden. But interestingly, so cardiovascular diseases, remember from the risk assessment. Cardiovascular diseases were a big part of that estimate for household use of solid fuels. These are studies looking at cardiovascular risks from air pollution. So here at lower levels, this is a log linear scale. So if you look at, here we have outdoor air pollution and passive smoking and its impact on cardiovascular mortality and disease. At the higher end of exposures, there's active tobacco smoking, and there's this big gap in the middle. And that gap is indoor smoke from solid fuels. And we have very, very little evidence, that's direct evidence that's been done on cardiovascular disease incidence or cardiovascular mortality from household use from solid fuels. So a lot of these estimates for the global burden of disease are based on integrated responses. So using this curve and saying, okay, given that this is about where household smoke from solid fuels falls, this is where we think the disease burden is to cardiovascular disease. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing that is linking household use of solid fuel to cardiovascular disease, so some of the intermediary indicators that we look at. And then I'm going to talk about some of the work that we do on intervention. So specifically, what are household level interventions or changes that can be used to reduce household air pollution exposures and indoor concentrations. And then look at this question. This is a study that we're doing right now, which is a question, can we actually use these interventions to improve health and climate at a population level? And then if I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're planning to do in China that's trying to assess, all right, given that this is such a big exposure, and we can't do these studies for cardiovascular disease and other chronic disease because of the challenges around exposure assessment, what are some potential methods that we might be able to use to assess exposure at a population level? So most of the work that I'm going to be talking about specifically on cardiovascular risks from household air pollution has been done in southwestern China, so in Sichuan province and in Yunnan province. This is one of our field sites. I'm actually going to be there in about 2 days from now. So this is our field sites sort of run from the Huangdong Mountains that are in the foothills of the Himalayas up farther north into the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau. So this is a very different area of China than I think we usually see in the media or the news. It's a heavily agricultural area, rural area, very low levels of ambient air pollution. And also it's a heavily forested area. So use of wood, and particularly southwestern China, it's poorer, and they also have high use of wood because it's a cheap fuel source and easily accessible fuel source for people. So these are pictures from our study sites, but are scenarios that are common in many areas of the world where people burn biomass or coal inside of their wood charcoal inside of their homes. So on the left is a home that's using an open fire for frying their lunch. And on the right-hand side these are two kids in a home. This is a stove that's used for both heating as well as cooking. So right now they're using it for space heating. And then later on, the fire will be fired up a bit more, and they'll use it for cooking their food. And about half the world's population is exposed to pollution from these stoves. So for our studies, we've done a personal exposure assessment to PM2.5. So PM2.5 is the pollutant or pollutant size, so particulate matter that's less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And this is the pollutant size that we show that's most strongly associated with health outcomes, which is the reason why we include it in our studies. And then we also measure black carbon, which is a component in PM2.5 that is specifically related to combustion pollution. So that includes things like wood smoke, but also traffic and other things. And we assess women's exposure for 24 hours, so a 24-hour period for 1 to 3 days. To try to get an idea of day-to-day variability in their exposure. But then we also conduct these same measurements seasonally, so we can do them in the winter and the summer and understand how that changes as well. We look at a handful of different health outcomes for these studies. Typically, so I talked earlier about cardiovascular disease mortality. So some of you might be doing studies on that on your own, or cardiovascular events, so a stroke or a heart attack. But because we can't, it's difficult for us to monitor exposure, and as well as sort of monitoring populations in these areas for long periods of time that you would need as part of a longer-term cohort study. What we do is we look at intermediary cardiovascular markers. So these are markers that we think are associated with, in some cases we know are strongly associated with risk of cardiovascular events or cardiovascular disease. So central blood pressure being blood pressure of the aorta, as well as brachial blood pressure. So when you go to the doctor, that's the kind of blood pressure measurement that you would get. We measure arterial stiffness as well as different biomarkers. So one being a biomarker of inflammation that's in the blood, as well as cellular aging. which is on telomere length. So we actually take samples in people's cheeks of buccal or buccal cells, depending on where you fall on that pronunciation of that. And there's sort of these protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, and it's associated, they've been shortening of telomeres has been associated with air pollution. And there's also some evidence showing that there's an inverse relationship between telomere shortening and cardiovascular disease risk. So we do those measurements in people's homes, and I should add, I mean, a lot of these measurements are actually measurements that are done in top hospitals in London or Montreal, but we do them in people's homes. We have a great field team that we've trained to do that. And then we also look at all of these other things that we know matter for cardiovascular disease risk, so anthropometrics, nutritional variables, and other behavioral variables like secondhand smoking, sociodemographic characteristics like socioeconomic status, medication use. So this is from Yunnan. This is a study that we had with 280 women, and this is showing their average PM2.5 or 24-hour PM2.5 exposure. So this is PM2.5 mass in the winter and the summer. I want to point out a couple things about this. Probably the most obvious thing is that there's a huge difference between winter and summer exposure. There was a group that was here that was at the talk yesterday, so I won't spend too much time on this. But one of the reasons for that is winter heating, right? So people are heating their homes. They're not as involved in agricultural activities as they are in the summer. And we also find that it dramatically exceeds the WHO PM2.5 guideline. So that's around 25 micrograms per meter cube for 24 hours. Their yearly average is 10, or yearly average guideline is 10 micrograms per meter cube. And it's exceeding that for all of the women in our study. And notably, so these groups of ages that we have here, we selected those age groups because of behavioral patterns and people who are more or less likely to cook. And we found there actually wasn't that big of a difference. Our surveys weren't doing a great job for this or for other variables of differentiating exposure for these women, whether or not you were cooking or not cooking. We looked at other things like frequency of time spent in the kitchen, primary cooking fuel, and they didn't do a great job of differentiation. So this is the study that was looking specifically at PM2.5 exposure, so personal exposure to PM2.5 and systolic blood pressure. So after adjusting for all of those covariates, age, waist circumference, nutrition, this is the predicted dose-response relationship for older women in our study between PM2.5 and exposure and systolic blood pressure. I'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but this log linear relationship has really important implications for interventions, because it means that if, for instance, if we have a person, so this is the exposure range for our population. So our exposure range from around 15 to just over 600 micrograms per meter cubed for our study population. And so if you have someone in this higher range and you're only able to have their pollution exposure, that doesn't buy you much in terms of health. Right? So we have to get people down to really clean levels in order to see a health benefit. Notably, we also found this impact that of black carbon was exposure to black carbon, which is a marker of combustion. So it's on the same pollution sample. And we found that that was more strongly associated with systolic blood pressure than PM2.5. So black carbon is a climate relevant pollutant. So it may be the case that we have these pollutants that are more strongly associated with climate, but also more strongly associated with health, which when we're thinking about, intervention evaluation, it's useful to find those indicators that can work for both environment as well as health for some of these environmental variables. So these are results, it's from a small pilot study in the Tibetan Plateau in Sichuan. So it's just 25 women. But this is a pilot study that we did to look at whether or not we could conduct some of these vascular measurements in a rural village setting. So they hadn't really been done before outside of hospitals in high-income countries. And so we looked at a handful of different cardiovascular indicators. So blood pressure, which you're probably familiar with, as well as some measures of arterial stiffness, augmentation index, and pulse wave velocity. Central pulse pressure, which is the difference between your systolic and diastolic pressure and is associated with cardiovascular risk. And again, this measure of telomere length. So this is cellular aging. And then we looked at we had a small sample size. So we looked at women who were above the median exposure, and we compared them to women whose exposure was below the median, which was around the median in this case was 58 micrograms per meter cube. This was in summer. And I don't have the data here. You'll just have to trust me. But the two exposure groups were very similar. So they were almost identical in age, salt intake, waist circumference, all these other things that we have very good evidence are predictors or are associated with higher blood pressure. They were almost identical, but if we look at some of these cardiovascular risks between the two air pollution groups, nothing is statistically significant, but we do find evidence that is sort of supporting what our hypothesis would be, which is that there's a relationship between higher exposure to PM2.5 in this population and these cardiovascular risk factors, and also some of these biomarkers like telomere length. So this is this is log transformed telomere length, so it's a 43% shorter telomere length in people that are higher exposed to air pollution. And some of these others, so our brachial and central systolic blood pressure, about a 5 millimeter of mercury, 4 millimeter mercury difference, actually tracks pretty well with what we found in Yunnan. So again, providing evidence that in both, so this is a univariate model, and this is a model that's just adjusted for age and BMI, but providing evidence, again, supportive of this relationship between PM and these intermediary indicators of cardiovascular disease. So what does this actually mean on a population level? What does this mean for cardiovascular disease risk? So this is the relationship between systolic blood pressure and risk of stroke in Asian women. And so if we look at the relationship between different age groups for women, we find that if you decrease, this is looking at the decrease in risk. And so if you move from higher systolic blood pressure to lower systolic blood pressure, it directly reduces your risk of stroke. And if we take an 8 millimeter decrease in systolic blood pressure, which we actually think is doable given the exposures that people are exposed to, as well as our parameter estimates for systolic blood pressure, it's about a 30% reduction in stroke and a 25% reduction in coronary heart disease. So again, this is an exposure that affects half the world's population. So it's a very large population that is exposed. And so when you have these 8 millimeters of mercury is actually quite large, but you would have drugs would probably be, if you have like a diuretic or something like that, would result in a greater decrease in systolic blood pressure. That's still pretty clinically significant, but also significant at a population level. So if we're moving on this assumption that there's this relationship between not just solid fuel smoking cardiovascular risk, but also all these other health impacts. So in the first slide on the disease study, there's respiratory health impacts, lung cancer, acute lower respiratory infection in kids. It's a question of how do we actually identify interventions that are going to work to reduce people's exposures. And this is a big challenge. So even if we're taking a conservative estimate, there's about 650 million low polluting cooking and heating stoves that needed to be placed into homes and replace solid fuel stoves, so to meet that need. And to put this in perspective, to put this in perspective, so since 2008, there's been 500 million iPhones that have sold. So something that is as ubiquitous as an iPhone all over the world is still not the number of stoves that we need to replace. So this brings up this enormous challenge of trying to address this. It's a big problem, but there's also a huge need for interventions. So some things that we have evidence on in terms of this transition to very polluting stoves to cleaner burning fuels, or cleaner burning fuels. So if we have is that there's this relationship between fuel efficiency, or how clean burning the fuel is, and wealth. And this is a very simplified version of what is a complex, both within the household as well as within countries, a complex issue. But typically, so if you have these higher polluting fuels, unprocessed wood, crop residues, as people gain more income, transitioning to things like coal or wood charcoal, so things that you're not necessarily harvesting for free but might have to buy. And then at the higher end, things like fuels like that we use, so electricity, gas-based fuels. But what I want to point out is sort of in this transition to cleaner burning fuels, it's not this sort of you move from one to the next to the next. What we find is that households will, as they gain income, they tend to increase the number of fuels in the home, and they're sort of choosing from a menu of fuels that they're using. So rather than completely substituting out, they're sort of taking from a larger quantity of fuels that are now available to their income pool. And China is an example of this. So this is between 1980 and around 2000. This is rural household energy use per capita. And so the green and orange would be solid fuels, and the yellow and, you can't quite see it, but the red would be some of the things that we would call cleaner burning fuels, so gas or electricity. And despite the fact this is the percentage of the population that lives in in poverty in rural areas, and so with some of the rural economic reforms that happened in China, you had a huge improvements in income and wealth in rural areas of China. But what we find is that the change that happened during this time period is that people use more energy, and they are also using cleaner burning fuels, but that use of higher polluting, low efficiency fuels persists. And this is seen in many, many different places. So for whatever reason, the use of, or transition rather, to these cleaner burning fuels isn't really tracking with development. And this is seen in China, this is seen in India, this is seen in many, many places in the world. So given this challenge of switching to fuels, one potential intervention or alternative intervention that's been proposed is whether or not you could have clean biomass stoves that would be alternatives to these cleaner burning fuels. Okay, so these would be fuels that you don't necessarily have to, or stoves that you don't necessarily have to switch the fuel type, but that you could have a stove that burns more cleanly than a traditional biomass burning stove. So rather than having this transition to more expensive fuels, this would be an alternative to that. This is actually fairly new. So recently the WHO has tried to classify, and in fact, Hisham has been involved in some of this work, has been trying to classify tiers of stoves. So there's remarkable variability in the quality of what we call improved biomass stoves, which some that are really lower polluting and others that aren't that different from the traditional stove. And so what they've tried to do is say, okay, you have these stoves where if you just add a chimney, you're not necessarily improving combustion efficiency. Or if you have charcoal stoves, so stoves that again are polluting high amounts or are emitting high amounts of pollutants like carbon monoxide, those are tier 0 stoves. And then it moves all the way to stoves that are tier 4 stoves. So those are the ones that are the most efficient and the cleanest burning stoves, as a way of trying to categorize these stoves into different categories. Because there are so many of them, and for a long time they were kind of just put together into this big pot of, no pun intended, of stoves. They were just all considered the same, even though their performance was very different. So this is, I should have explained this, this is carbon monoxide on the y-axis and PM emissions on the x-axis. So you can see huge variability in those stoves. And that has implications for exposure as well. So I'm not going to get into all of these. Are a handful of intervention studies that have been done globally. And the numbers of people that were monitored for this vary, or numbers of homes. So it varies from like 8 people to just over 100 people. And if you look at black, so the black is, for each study, the black shows the pre-intervention exposure or household concentration. And the blue is the post-intervention. So these are biomass stoves, concentration or exposure. And then here we have this blue line, the blue line and the green line, red line, black line. So those are different levels of, or guidelines or standards. So here we have the WHO the WHO 24-hour and yearly guidelines, so what levels that are considered safe for exposure. And then we also have the interim guidelines. So these have been put into place as, okay, if we can't get quite there to these really low concentrations, can we get to these interim levels? And I just want to point out that in every single one of these intervention studies, with the exception of one that has a sample size of 8, it's really been ineffective in getting people to exposures or household concentrations that would be considered safe, are considered safe by the WHO. So one example of that is the intervention trial that was done in Guatemala. So this is a really nicely designed study. So it's a randomized trial with a chimney stove intervention. Lots of time put into selecting a stove that would work for the population who lives there. Lots of time into developing very, very good measurements that were conducted in the study. And so if we look at the decrease in kitchen pollution concentrations, this is carbon monoxide as used as a proxy for PM. And so this is the control group, and this is the intervention group. So there was about a 90% decrease in kitchen pollution for households that were in, and pollution being in this case carbon monoxide, not PM, for households that were in the intervention group. But we see less of an impact for exposure. So why might it be the case that exposure didn't decrease to the same extent as kitchen concentrations? This is a chimney stove. So here is the combustion chamber, and then here's the pipe that goes outside of the household. What might be a reason why you wouldn't see, if you're seeing a 90% decrease in kitchen concentrations, this is the primary source of exposure, why would you only see a 15% decrease in infants' exposure? So community levels of pollution, right? So venting outdoors, if people walk outdoors or pollution, you just vent it into your neighbor's house, right? Or it comes back into your own house, right? So getting very clean levels of combustion is important. So how low does exposure actually need to be for health? So here, this is our work on blood pressure. We found this log linear relationship showing that you actually need to get exposures down to very low levels to see a health benefit or the best health benefit. And on the left-hand side, this is the exposure response, an integrated exposure response relationship for PM and acute lower respiratory infections in kids, which is finding the same log linear relationship. So you have a really sharp increase in risk at low levels, and then it sort of flattens out you get at higher concentrations. So getting things down very, very low through efficient combustion is very important. But how do we actually do this, right? How do we get our stove interventions? How do we identify stove interventions and test stove interventions that are going to reduce pollution concentrations and exposures at a population level? So that's some of the work that we've been doing recently, both in terms of trying to think about ways that we can test and identify stoves that will be more likely to meet people's needs in homes, but that also can combust cleanly in homes. So you need to do both, right? And so this is work that I've done in collaboration with Tsinghua University in China, and in particular Professor Shudong Yang, which is this sort of iterative engineering process on stove design. So it's, in some cases, starting with the design of a stove, testing it in the laboratory, or maybe you have a stove that you already know of that you can test in the laboratory, moving it to a rural energy lab. So this is an area that has houses that kind of look like a village, but they're equipped with air monitoring equipment that is similar to what you have in the lab, but it kind of mimics the field, so you can look at some of these behavioral components. And then lastly, putting these interventions in homes and actually evaluating them there. And often there should be an arrow. That's pointing from here back, because this is a process, right? So it's a process that you go through all of these steps many times. So I'm going to talk about some of the examples that we've done relating to this. This is a study that was done by Ellison Carter at the University of Minnesota, who works on our China projects. There are a handful of gasifier stoves. So gasifier stoves are stoves that They've been a very popular stove in the household air pollution community because they have the potential for low combustion. So it basically heats processed biomass, creates gases, and then puts them on, like basically sets those gases on fire. So it burns somewhat similarly to when you think of LPG, it burns similarly to that. It's a powerful flame and can be low polluting. And we wanted to sort of test these different semi-gasifier stoves that everyone was talking about and saying that these were fantastic, but there wasn't actually a lot of testing, both in terms of how they relate through standardized tests with other stoves, but also how robust they are to different behaviors, right? We actually see this big difference between laboratory and field performance. Why is that happening, right? So we wanted to kind of get at that question. So this is similar to the slide that I showed earlier from the WHO. These are stoves that were tested by Jim Jetter at the US EPA. So he tested several gasifier stoves, some rocket stoves, which are basically improved biomass stoves that have varying degrees of difference from a traditional stove, but ranging from a more insulated combustion chamber, changes in airflow design, or a three-stone fire, which is like your traditional cooking stove, like 3 stoves, you set a pot on top of it and you cook. And again, these are the WHO cookstove standards. So this is where they fall in that ranking of stoves, from 0 being the most high polluting stove and 4 being a low polluting stove. And you can see that that matches up with the CO emissions as well as the PM 2.5 emissions. And so in our test, doing a standard, this is a water boiling test. So it looks at the PM emissions per megajoule of energy that's going into the pot during cooking. So this is standardized for all of these stoves. We found huge variability in the performance of these gasifier stoves. So these are stoves that were kind of all put into one category of stove, but remarkably different performance. So in some cases, you have stoves that are falling into the tier 3 or even on the border of tier 4 stoves, all the way up to stoves that fall outside into the most polluting stove tier. So these are stoves that were previously kind of all lumped together and classified as gasifiers. These are the potential to be, tier 3, tier 4 stoves, and we found that that's not always the case. Large variability between them. And then we also did a series of tests to try and mimic the way people cook, but systematically evaluate that in a lab. So one thing that we looked at, or that Ellison looked at as this, was looking at lighting and cooking. So monitoring real-time PM 2.5 throughout the cooking process. So up until recently, those standards that I was showing, they only included cooking. So it started here. And this is how they quantified what the PM emissions were during a water boiling test. So where are the bulk of emissions coming from in this process? Lighting, right? So up until recently, so at the time when she conducted this study, lighting wasn't actually included in that, which is a huge source of pollution. When is a person more likely to be close to the fire? During lighting, right? So this is one thing that trying to get at this question of, all right, why are we seeing these differences between lab and field? How can we improve our evaluation of these stoves so that we can choose stoves that are more likely to perform better in the lab as well as in the field? The second thing that she looked at for this study was looking at PM that's emitted during various power phases of stove operation. So in the past, there was most of the studies that would be done in that standard water boiling test would use high power. So that's the way that you would test the stove, is using this high power. So she said, okay, well, if you're using a flash fry, high power is great for that. But what if you want to simmer? So a lot of homes use, they're simmering sauces, or maybe they're simmering rice. Does that actually impact the emissions that are coming from that stove? And again, this is the PM mass that was emitted during each of these phases, so a simmer versus a flash fry, and almost twice the levels of pollutants that were emitted by just changing the behavior, so the way that you were cooking. And again, that wouldn't be picked up in a standardized test. So I think using these kinds of sort of systematically evaluating behaviors in a lab, and while I actually think that getting into the field is the most important, and I'll talk about that in a bit, trying to do these sort of systematic evaluations of behaviors can be one way of maybe eliminating the stoves that aren't going to be robust in the field and sort of trying to select at least stoves that are more likely to be successful and perform the way that people want them to. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the development and design work of improved stoves that's we've been doing, and this is the Tsinghua Stove. So one of the things that with the gasifiers that I was talking about earlier is we tested a handful of them, both in the lab and the field, and we actually couldn't find one that would have low emissions, but that also would work with the way that we know people cook in China. And we sort of did some recon work and actually visited villages where these different gasifier stoves had been implemented. So not these here, but the ones in the previous pictures. And a lot of them had fallen into disuse and disrepair because they didn't work like people wanted them to. So this is work that my colleagues at Tsinghua have been doing. So I showed that sort of that iterative engineering process. This is kind of this is maybe version 5 of the stove that they had developed. This is probably version 7, and this is the most recent version of a stove. And you can see that it's changed. So it's actually changed the stove design. This is a stove that can fit inside people's chimney stoves, so you don't lose the ventilation properties. It has, this is a place where you add processed biomass pellets. So you can add them here, you turn a crank, and the pellets go into the combustion chamber. You press this button here and it starts, so the fire actually lights. And you can continuously add fuel if you want to cook for longer. So you can add fuel here if you want to cook for a longer period of time. And then there's also, so right here, you can see this knob, that actually enables you to adjust the flame. All right, and one of the reasons so that there's a handful of differences in these versions of stoves, and I'll get into some of the details about why those changes were made. But one thing is that is you can see the shift in size of stoves. So trying to find something that would combust cleanly, but that also could fit inside traditional stoves without destroying their kitchen was one of the challenges. So after we had a stove that was burning relatively cleanly, so this is after the lab process has gone through, after we tested it in our lab field setting, we actually put these stoves into homes. So we put them in pilot homes to test them for 3 to 6 month periods. And the goal of this is we knew we had a stove that would combust cleanly, but we wanted to see how it was going to work with people using it. Is it going to be responsive to regional preferences in this area and how people cook? So this is what the stove looks like. It fits into their traditional stove, their vented stove. So here, in most of the homes, the chimney would be here. So in this woman's home, the chimney is here. So you still take advantage of a chimney, but even though it does combust relatively cleanly, but then it integrates into their they don't have to change the stove that they're cooking on. So they can still cook on their traditional wok stove. And this is some evaluation work that was done by my student, Rosalinda Chen. So this is looking at, this is an earlier version of the stove that she evaluated. So this is temperature. It's a temperature sensor that's placed on the stove. So it's monitoring stove use patterns. And this is at 5 weeks post putting the stove in the home. And so the red, it's a little bit unclear, but the red is the gasifier stove. The black is the traditional stove. So there we had one traditional stove that was still in the home, and then we also had this new gasifier stove that was put in the home. And to look at what happens here, so we see that people are using the gasifier stove, or this family is using the gasifier stove, and they're also using the traditional stove. But again, if we think about the levels of pollution that are needed for health, we almost need to eliminate the use of the traditional stove. So there's a reason why they're using it, and we wanted to know why. So what uses is the gasifier stove not meeting? So she did a nice qualitative analysis with focus groups and women who were using these stoves. And what we found was that the advantages of the gasifier, it was great for flash frying, They liked that it was safer, so there wasn't the same, they weren't having the same amount of like small burns that they would get on their hands with the other stoves. But that they weren't able to use it for low power, so they weren't able to use it for cooking some of the dishes that they used. They didn't like that they were continually having to add pellets, so it was burning through the pellets too quickly, and then they would have to turn the crank, and they weren't happy about that. And then we also had some maintenance issues. So there was a coil that was an ignition coil. So remember I talked about you push a button and it starts, and that was breaking. And so we needed to repair all of those things. So I can't show the final version of the stove because my colleagues at Tsinghua have requested that I not include that in the presentation. But I do want to say that these kinds of studies, so this was done 5 times in villages, right? So it was a stove went in, it was evaluated both in terms of use and then qualitative information about what needs it was meeting and what needs it wasn't. And then it was sort of this cycle of going back and trying to make these changes. So for example, now we have an adjustable flame that can meet low power. These maintenance issues with the coil were fixed. And so it kept the advantages, but we were able to adjust some of the other pieces of the stove so it could better meet household needs without losing the low emissions. And I just want to add this. I think on the stove development and design process, I think as a public health person, I hadn't necessarily considered the importance of the industrial partner in manufacturing of the stoves. And that's actually been really important for us. So in the manufacturing of some of the initial stoves to go out, this is not the final version, but having an industrial partner that was really helpful in trying to help us understand pricing, so how to get what changes could be made to the stove so that it's still going to function, but that we can get prices down lower than they were. But also having a manufacturer that's able to produce in large enough scale. So a big problem with cook stove interventions, it's really often that you'll talk to people putting a stove into villages, an NGO or a different implementer, and they're like, yeah, we ran out of stoves. We just can't get the manufacturer to produce fast enough. So that was a really key process for us in this process, is finding a manufacturer that could help work with us to keep the functionality of the stove, the low emissions of the stove, but produce it at mass scale, and also have it where that it could still function as well with the low emissions. So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about a study that's ongoing right now. So we have this stove that we've been working on and developing, the Tsinghua Stove. And then the next step as part of that was, if we put this stove into a large number of homes, can it benefit air quality, climate, and public health? So again, this is our field site in the Tibetan Plateau. I don't want to spend too much time on this other than to just say that this region is a particularly vulnerable area to climate from pollutants like black carbon. So black carbon, which is emitted from, a large proportion of black carbon is emitted from cook stoves or incomplete combustion of cook stoves. So this is work by Tammy Bond, that it's likely to increase warming within the atmosphere and contribute to regional warming. It's associated with changes in weather patterns, as well as glacial melting in the Himalayas, where our field site is. And so actually, it's funny, this is a paper from Tammy Bond's study on black carbon, and her arrow actually points exactly to our field site, which is useful. I don't even have to add it myself. So these stoves, so these are similar to what you've seen before. This is a typical kitchen where people are burning wood, so it's usually wood and crop residues in chimney stoves. We finished our first season of measurements for this study, but I don't have all of the exposure data. But in a subsample, so about 80 women, the average exposure in the summer, so we anticipate that winter will be higher, but in the summer was 137 micrograms per meter cubed, again exceeding the WHO guideline of 25, or even the interim guideline of 35 micrograms per meter cubed, with a range of 29 to over 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed over a 24-hour period. So the goal of this study is to, we have an energy package that is going into homes. So it's a cooking stove as well as a heating stove. And They are both run on pelletized biomass fuel. So this is the village-level pellet factory that's been built at our study site. So one of the things that the government of China is trying to do right now is transition homes from coal to biomass or processed biomass. And so we're in the south. This isn't a coal burning area, but there is still funding available for that. So testing out whether or not you can produce these pellets at the village level that can then be used for village level interventions. So our study design, this is, in total, this is around a 5-year intervention study. We're enrolling 200 women in 200 homes that are in 8 villages in this area of the Tibetan Plateau. We're not randomizing for this study. And I have to say that this is something that I think all of us you guys are all in public health, right? So randomization, this is when we think about like the gold standard. There are many really nice things about randomizing your population. And we didn't do it for several reasons. One is that if you randomize, so you do it on a household level, and we were concerned about randomizing if you remember the community pollution issues, right? So if you choose one home and they have an intervention package, but their neighbors are all burning biomass in a chimney stove, that's going to go right into their home. So we might not actually see the benefit of the intervention because it's being confounded by their neighbors' pollution. The other reason why we did this is because if we think about the way that China implements interventions, nothing is done on a household level in China, absolutely nothing. So any intervention that's going in is at least happening at the village scale, probably at the administrative village rather than the natural village, so the natural village being the smaller unit of a village. And so we didn't have a large enough sample size to randomize at a village level, so we decided to not randomize and instead intervene by village. So we have about half of the villages that are getting the intervention sooner, and the other half that will get the intervention package a little bit later. And as part of this study, we do measurements on air pollution and health for 2 to 6 days every 6 months in 200 homes over 3 years. So as a timeline, so some of the work that we've been doing that I just showed you on the design and development of an intervention has been done since 2012. We have a pellet factory that's been installed. Last summer, we did baseline and health measurements, so we do a year of both winter and summer measurements. In spring of this year, about 120 of the homes will receive the stove, so this is a cooking and a heating stove, and we'll continue measurements through the next 2 years. And I think probably in 2016, we'll evaluate how the stove is doing and whether or not we should put the stoves in the remaining number of homes or if we should wait for another year. The goals of this study, so our first aim is to see whether or not this intervention package, whether or not can it reduce pollution emissions and exposures. So our goal for this study and our goal for the intervention was really to try to get things as clean as we possibly could. So we measure in homes, we do a handful of air pollution measurements. We measure PM and a handful of gases in homes. We also do measurements, direct emissions from people's chimneys to figure out like what's coming directly from the stove as well as how much of that is going into the kitchen. We measure people's personal exposure every 6 months for between 48 and 144 hours, so 2 to 6 days of personal exposure monitoring, so in the same packs that are shown in that picture. And then we also collect information on fuel use, stove activity, and we conduct ambient air pollution measurements. And I included this picture. If anyone has ever done fuel wood measurements before, I was talking to Hisham about this earlier, we found that IKEA bags are amazing. So they hold up incredibly well, like better than anything that we've ever used. So I'm putting my plug in for IKEA, and they get more of my business now that I'm buying their bags. Which has been, so it's basically just trying to assess the amount of wood that people are using. So you actually weigh it before and after a cooking period. My colleague, Christine Wiedemeyer at NCAR, is doing a modeling assessment with this, so trying to look at the climate benefits of this stove. So under the assumption that we'll see changes with the intervention, if this is scaled up in the region, what would be the regional or global climate changes under baseline as well as baseline and intervention scenarios? So this is work that her colleague had done looking at changes in PM emissions for pre and post and during monsoon seasons. So basically doing these kinds of models or these change models to look at climate impacts. And then we do a handful of cardiovascular measurements as well. So I talked a bit about some of them already. So we measure blood pressure, we measure cardiopulmonary function through a 6-minute walk test, arterial stiffness. We collect a handful of biological markers. We collect urine, blood, again, some of the cheek cells for telomere length. And then we collect information on these important covariates that we know matter for cardiovascular health. So I'm not able to present the study is ongoing. I don't know what our impact is going to be. I'll come back at some point in time in the next couple of years and I'll present those. But assuming we estimate that our pre-intervention exposure by the time you add in winter pollution conservatively is around 170 micrograms per meter cubed. So based on the dose-response relationship that we found both at this study site as well as other places in China, we think a conservative estimate is that with this stove we can get into exposure down to 30 micrograms per meter cubed, which is a 9 millimeter of mercury decrease in systolic blood pressure. So again, it's clinically relevant. 9 millimeters of mercury is actually fairly clinically relevant, even for an individual, but on a population level, certainly so. So I'm actually going to stop here in the interest of time and questions. But I just want to quickly add and talk about the policy implications of our findings. I mean, I hope I've convinced you that I think there's fairly good evidence showing that household air pollution is associated with cardiovascular impacts, and that reducing a cardiovascular disease burden in a place like China, as well as thinking about intervention. So it's really a process. So the intervention, it's not just simply sort of putting the intervention into homes. And I think this is something we all know in public health, but somehow it doesn't fall into practice because we don't have the budget for it, or we don't have the time, and it's not easy to do, right? But sort of thinking about the intervention, the sort of scoping of your intervention should be just as long as your evaluation of the intervention, if not longer. So making sure that if we're putting all this money and time into evaluation, that we're selecting things that we think actually have a chance of doing something. And this should be something, and I have to say, like, I have certainly been part of studies where I think I haven't put an adequate enough amount of time into vetting the intervention in advance. But that's something that I've really learned in trying to focus my work on. So I just want to acknowledge all of our collaborators in the UK, in China, in North America, and our funding agencies. And these are actually the pictures at the bottom are our field staff. And I can't stress enough, like, as I'm about to head to the field, I mean, your studies, they really live and die by your field team. I mean, they're so, so important. And our field team is excellent. They do fantastic measurements. And the success of our study it really in some ways rests in their hands. And I also want to specifically credit Ellison Carter at the University of Minnesota, who is responsible for training such a fantastic field team and having, these guys are doing measurements that graduate students are doing, and they have a high school or a middle school education. So absolutely fantastic. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Sure, there's a good reason, but why the gender bias on the people whose health you're evaluating?
Yeah, so a couple things for that. So one, I talked about this, so men smoke at really high rates in China, and we're not confident that we can actually adequately quantify what the impact is of their smoking on cardiovascular disease risk or intermediary markers. But we have started actually doing, in non-smoking men, at the Sichuan site, I didn't talk about this, but we have started, we don't have a large enough sample size because so many men smoke to include them in a health analysis, but we have started to include them in paired 6-day sampling with their spouse. So we enroll, the mother and then the husband, and we monitor their exposure. There isn't a difference in their exposure. It's exactly the same. I mean, so it's certainly, this is a population that's also being exposed to high concentrations. It's certainly cardiovascular relevant because they're even more vulnerable to cardiovascular events in many cases than women. But the smoking levels make it hard to do a health study. Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. That was a great talk. I'm just wondering about the blood pressure effect. So, I mean, it looked like what you're looking at is an acute effect, and sort of assuming that if you long-term reduce the levels, that change becomes sort of a permanent change in blood pressure. And I'm just wondering, like, so for like cardiovascular mortality, we know that like the acute effects, the chronic effects aren't just the sum of the acute effects because it's probably contributing to the underlying disease. So is there, for blood pressure, is there a distinction between acute effect and chronic, or is the chronic just sort of the sum of being exposed every day acutely?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I mean, I think I'd answer that in a couple ways. And the first is not going to be as helpful, but it's something that I struggle with, which is that, like, if you have a consistent acute impact, but you're cooking with cook stoves every day, at what point does that become chronic? Right. So I think there's that, right? If you have this consistent effect every single day of your life, then is that acute or is it chronic? I mean, and then in terms of the mechanisms, right? So there's evidence showing that there's acute impacts from PM 2.5 from an autonomic nervous system response. There's evidence of longer term impacts, both for blood pressure as well as for arterial stiffness, right? So both of those. So what we're trying to do for this study, so one of the reasons why we have a 2-year evaluation period with blood pressure, which could be acute, could be chronic, or chronic impact or improvement. But we're also including cardiopulmonary function. And so we're trying to look at these measurements in the short and long term. So we'll have, immediately post-intervention, 6 months, and then up to 2 years. But then we'll also have things like cardiopulmonary function, which would be a more longer term benefit that would be provided with reduced blood pressure. But I think trying to tease those out is really hard. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. So the way that we made that calculation, so it was estimated based on, when I say calculation, I mean back of the envelope calculation. But we did a couple things. So one is that we do have source apportionment. So we I did a chemical analysis on a small subset of exposure samples to look at where pollution was coming from. So it's coming from different places, right? So people are getting exposed. It's cooking fuels. It's cooking grease, right? So when they're flash frying, that's actually a fairly significant contributor to their exposure. In fact, if you don't want to sleep well at night, you can think about that for a long time in that log linear dose response relationship, and it starts to bother you. But and you start to think about fans. but I think so. We looked at sort of where people's exposure was coming from in an average subset of the population. And then we specifically looked at what our estimate was for smoke from biomass. So biomass being both the fuel starter that people are using, so pine needles and things like that, as well as wood. And then we took that and estimated sort of what the reduction could be based on our laboratory and field-based studies of emissions of the pilot stoves. So that's how we came up with that number. And that's very simple. So it's not nearly as, I think, complex as the measure that you're talking about. I mean, like the great job that I did remembering this. Try to be better. Oh. Yeah. It's expensive. So we're not, and I say this because I mean, to be honest, like price wasn't our goal. Like our goal for this was, can we actually have an intervention that works, that can reduce pollution, and that can perform the way that people want it or expect it to in homes. So the price point right now at small scale production of the stove is $100 US dollars. It's expensive. In talking with the manufacturers, they think that number can actually be reduced quite a bit as you scale up. So I'm speaking on behalf of my Tsinghua colleagues a bit here, but their goal has not been a village level study. Their goal is rural China. So this stove is being tested at our field site, but it's also being tested in northern China, in northeastern China. So their goal is really, they see this as something that could be implemented in millions and millions of homes. And then the price point drops quite a bit, but what actually that price point is, we don't know. But it is expensive. It's an expensive stove. But not compared to, yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, is sort of how much of your average income a rural Chinese farmer is spending on an iPhone. It's a significant, I mean, people will spend 3 months of their yearly income on an iPhone, which is a lot.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions.
That was great, thank you. Lots of support from about 20